Brace yourself.
Sonic the Hedgehog for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 left a large blemish on its series legacy. It's widely regarded as one of the worst games of its era, a technically disastrous product, but also a failed chance to establish a different kind of universe for the titular hero to explore. It's buggy, it's messy, it's nonsensical. In a nutshell, it's a comedy of errors and rightfully judged as such. Right now, it sounds like I'm retreading old territory, fueling the redundancy of the YouTube critique machine. Sonic 06 isn't good. I think we all get it at this point. But here's something I do think needs addressing, because a lot of people aren't willing to say this. Despite so much of the game being of such low quality, Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 was a surprisingly faithful transition from the Sonic Adventure games. So many people joke that Sonic 06 is Sonic Adventure 3 in disguise, simply as a way to jab at fans who want that game to exist. But that joke doesn't come from just any old place. Sonic 06's core speed mechanics, wide variety of playable characters, and even its cinematic, story-heavy campaigns all stem from many of the same branches as Sonic Adventure 1 or 2. In a sense, the translation of those elements showed that Sega and Sonic Team were paying attention to the older 3D Sonic games in at least some small way. These ideas that existed in the past, ideas that are practically synonymous with the best parts of Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, they're in Sonic 06, and it doesn't take much digging to find them. Not to say the game is good by any stretch of the imagination, but I do believe that the ambition behind Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 came from an enthusiastic place at least. Quality of execution aside, Sonic Team knew which ideas needed to be brought over to the new generation. If you're wondering where I'm going with this, talking about a game whose critical legacy has been ground down to dust already, don't worry, there's a plan. Originally, this video was going to specifically be about video game reboots, games that straddle the line between entirely new ideas and established series. But I think the whole nomenclature of what a reboot actually is was becoming a bit of an issue. The same could be said of game remakes, remasters, and even sequels. In today's gaming ecosystem, defining these terms never feels entirely clear, and I admittedly wanted to avoid any kind of heated discussion of what these classifications are. The argument of what a reboot actually is would be a topic for another day. But for all of the arguments of what constitutes calling a game a reboot, remake, reimagining, or whatever, it comes down to one common factor. Something in the game wants to be iterated upon for the future. The original title must do something that attains value, something we want to see continue, even if the game's time in the limelight passes. These new iterations all do something different to make them feel distinctive from that original game. For reboots, it might be a fully new universe with a different kind of artistic vision. For reimaginings, it could be seeing how established narratives and systems are used in new context. However, whatever these changes are, the games do still have that common factor. Something is preserved from the original. Something is worth bringing over with us. Whatever that something isn't always consistent. That's the nature of an artistic medium. It's rich with ideas, and no single concept will fit every mold. If there's something we do find appealing in a piece of media, it's natural to want to see it again, perhaps in a fitter form than it was before. Demand for sequels, reboots, and reimaginings of our favorite games lead to franchises becoming things. The clamor for a follow-up to Mirror's Edge wasn't because the community wanted the bad things about the original to be preserved. It's because they wanted a revitalized approach to appear that could build upon the original and help it achieve its full potential, iterating on the positive ideas and giving them another chance. Of course, the long-awaited return in Mirror's Edge Catalyst continued the game-turned-series legacy of untapped potential, but this, once again, generated a clamor for the series' better attributes to be performed once more. Series are linked artifacts that share commonly iterated threads, whether that's the narrative, mechanics, or something entirely different, something that might be difficult to clearly define. Devil May Cry might have had a controversial entry in DMC Devil May Cry from Ninja Theory, but DMC's gameplay did share enough of the core design of a traditional 3D action game to still have some kinds of ties to the main series, even if its story changed the context of its hero Dante and the characters he interacts with. The 2018 God of War game might have completely changed the series' established action gameplay, but it at least connected Kratos' story to the old God of War games with striking mindfulness. Hence why I'm with its director, Cory Barlog, in that I'm hesitant to call it a reboot. In the case of games in the Final Fantasy series, that connective tissue might be a bit more difficult to identify because these games mostly exist in their own self-contained worlds without a single narrative to draw them together, along with design setups that might be indistinguishable from each other. Still, these games are tied together in some small way, driving home their iteration. Basically, these games all share some kind of essence with other games in their series, even if that might simply be the title of the game, as a way to grab eyes from people who pass by the shelf at the local game store. In a more cynical light, iteration can simply be a way to continue to generate income for the developer or publisher, and honestly, that's not wrong. Money is a driving force in the industry, but even when we take away that corporate motivation, it's encouraging to see something interesting from our favorite games appear again, even going so far as setting standards that have shaped the medium as a whole. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time popularized a lock-on targeting system, making it easier and more engrossing than ever to interact with a world in a 3D space. That popularization has resulted in lock-on becoming a game design standard that's appeared in countless games after its release. Here's something that might surprise you. As groundbreaking and player-friendly as the lock-on was in Ocarina of Time, it would never have become a standard if other developers didn't use it in later titles. Iteration is necessary for standards to exist. Without other creators considering ideas to ultimately be beneficial to the medium, the ideas don't receive iteration and simply disappear into obscurity. If the concept becomes successful enough, who knows, it might even become the standard by which we experience games as a whole. There's a reason that in the 90s, first-person shooters were called Doom clones, or 3D platformers were Mario 64 clones. Those were the years where the core elements of those genres were just starting to reach iteration. There was an origin point that we hadn't gotten far enough away from yet, so these genres' identities were still directly tied to these respective games. Of course, just because an idea is iterated upon doesn't mean that it will always be great. Not everything can be positively received enough to stay in the spotlight forever and become a standard. That's how and why trends occur. For example, Telltale's morality system sprung up during the popular height of binary morality systems in games like Infamous. During that period, the appeal of black and white morality systems was showing its more unnatural features, so having dialogue choices that were so good at hiding their moral context was fascinating. It's why Telltale's The Walking Dead was so widely praised back then. It felt new. It was an idea that openly challenged the established norm of the culture, that good versus evil morality systems supposedly gave players the depth and freedom to choose how they want to interact with a game's story. But once the veil was lifted and binary systems were shown to simply be playing the same game multiple times, it was time for Telltale to step in and make something more ambiguous. But that praise led to Telltale iterating their own ideas, saturating the scene and eroding away the nuance that made The Walking Dead such a success. They lifted their own veil, leading to their games becoming far too similar. Telltale's game design became a trend instead of a standard. What Telltale taught us was that even if you find a success, it takes a careful hand to iterate that success. Game design that feels inventive and innovative at the time can easily succumb to negative reception in the future, when that nuance begins to feel stale to us. The extensive scope and freedom of open world games has become more criticized now than it ever was back in the days of Grand Theft Auto 3. The hyper-realism of Heavy Rain is no longer the holy grail of graphic design when more stylized art direction has become so engrossing and impressive to the community. Despite our expressed desires for consistency and keeping things the same, we're admittedly pretty fickle beings. Things become dull to us over time, and we demand something new and fresh more frequently than we like to admit. We can't be fed the same stuff at the dinner table every night. Eventually, we're going to want something different. So I guess that poses a question. If we're always looking for something new, how do standards form? What turns a trend into a standard? It's a hard question to answer for sure, especially with so many bits of game design that have been firmly established in the medium for decades now. Super Mario 64's camera became the go-to design direction for exploration in a 3D space. Resident Evil 4's over-the-shoulder aiming is now commonplace in third-person shooters. What we now consider standards were nuanced and innovative at the time, daring to try something that hadn't been fully nailed down when no one had any perfect way to make a game. But here's the thing. These ideas were never free from change. Thanks to updated hardware and design, Super Mario 64's camera could be improved for a better player experience and more streamlined exploration, as seen in Super Mario Sunshine. Resident Evil 4 is still an amazing game that uses its camera well, but games like Gears of War and Dead Space eventually gave players more range of movement and viewpoints. As I mentioned earlier, no idea is perfect, so there are plenty of opportunities to try something a bit off the beaten path, improving standards and giving them the chance to evolve into entirely new standards. In a way, evolution is a different form of iteration. It's a method to take the best ideas of things we've ingrained in our subconscious as the way to go, and give them smaller adjustments for a better experience. They don't openly reject the past, they simply tune it up. Dismissing elements of a game because they appear dated or archaic is something I have my own personal disagreements with, but I can't argue against the claim that changing your game series can lead to something beneficial. Many games are built on small alterations. Automatic data saves have covered my ass far more than once. Inverted control options are my preferred method of play in modern first or third person games, and I simply can't imagine playing any title in 2020 that doesn't let you skip cutscenes. Even in small ways, evolution has its important place in game design. However, this doesn't mean that evolution is the only way to keep things fresh. Credit is due to developers who've totally overhauled their game's design into something culturally challenging and rich with nuance. It certainly takes guts to make such a dramatic change because, while we strive for new ideas after being fed the same stuff over and over, taking a giant leap instead of a small step doesn't necessarily lead to unanimous applause. Sometimes we need to ease ourselves into something different. Metroid Prime had the risky honor of moving the series into 3D, but also into first person, a task that had plenty of backlash, but one that also led to one of the most treasured games of its generation. The same could be said of the cel-shaded art direction of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. I'm not afraid to say that it definitely rubbed me the wrong way at first, but I eventually grew to love the aesthetic, as did many others. But these games had the advantage of still having iterated ideas to fall back on. Metroid Prime still had the exploration and ambiance of Super Metroid, just in a new perspective and with much higher graphical fidelity. Wind Waker was still a Zelda game with dungeons, enemies, and plenty to discover, despite how cartoony its graphic direction was. But when a game has very little to directly iterate upon, the reception is bound to be different. From the rise of art house games like Journey and Dear Esther to the mainstream acceptance of non-traditional controllers, there are plenty of examples throughout gaming history where something alternative managed to successfully capture a niche or form an entire zeitgeist. Hell, I'd even argue that Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts managed to do something very daring with its vehicle construction aspect in a 3D platformer. Sure, I still believe it's a terribly flawed game, but I can at least say in retrospect that its game design priorities were in a respectable place. I wouldn't have spent so long talking about it if I didn't think it was worth discussing. Not to say these gameplay directions were entirely original. Art house games were appearing as far back as the 1980s. Controllers were distancing themselves from gamepads long before the Wii and Kinect appeared, and Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts' vehicle building elements were partially inspired by Legos, a franchise that had already implemented construction elements into the gaming space. In a way, iteration can be applied unintentionally. Even if you think your idea has never been done before, there's a strong chance that you can trace it back to somewhere in gaming history. That's the burden of artistry and why chasing originality on a macro level can feel pretty hopeless at times. Still, there's a reason why we're discussing games like Journey this long after they're released. It's clear that games that take those giant leaps are naturally disruptive. There's dissatisfaction with the trends or standards that exist at that time, even if they're isolated to the series itself. It's just a part of how any artistic medium works. I think that's why, even in a video analyzing and praising iteration in video games, I can still say that singular, self-contained titles that never get dedicated iteration are still incredibly important to how we play games. Even in a world where anything can already be a thing and true originality can feel unattainable, we strive to find ideas that, at the very least, feel new. If you're diligent enough, you can trace any new idea back to its influences. And I'll provide a moment of self-awareness by saying that I think that takes the fun out of studying any kind of artistic medium, games or otherwise. Not everything needs to be that mechanical, so I'll leave well enough alone for now. It's admittedly interesting seeing how singular ideas grow into the greater picture of video games, but any great idea needs to have a community of iterators for it to be accepted in the way the creator wants it to be. Calling something a poor man's whatever might sound dismissive, but consider what you're saying. That something in that thing was important enough to its iterator to bring into their own creation. Something valuable exists there, and the iterator's intention was to show that. The least we can do is give different ideas a chance, see what they did right and wrong, and decide whether they have the potential to be worth continuing in the future. Whether it's a design concept, story beat, or a simple creative spark, it could be the next breakthrough for the series, genre, or even the medium as a whole. All it might take is giving it another shot.